It's an amazing election. Every one of these elections is a massive, massive game changer.
What's extraordinary is when the white smoke comes out, which is how they announce, we've got a pope, a person that now today you and I have probably not heard of is going to become overnight one of the best known, most recognised, most talked about, most written about people on the planet.
The rest of this politics is, as ever, powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And if you've got an electric vehicle or you're thinking of switching, Fuse can help you with that. They're offering a new overnight charging tariff that makes things very, very simple.
It's available now through their iOS app, and Android's on its way. It works with a wide and growing range of home chargers.
No obscure hardware, no complicated setup. You just plug in, you charge overnight, and you're on your way.
And you can even get that electric vehicle charger installed at home in as little as 7 days, depending on your setup. Hardware fitting the whole lot handled.
Which, let's be honest, is not something you hear about every product you deal with.
And when you sign up, you'll get Trip Plus membership completely free. That's not just ad-free listening. That's the amazing bonus episodes and unique interviews that we do, early access to Question Time, and pre-sale tickets to our live shows.
So while your car charges, you're also helping our podcast.
Just head to getfuse.com/politics, download the app, and use the code POLITICS when you sign up.
Practical, painless, no committee required.
Welcome to the Rest of This Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. Now, can I ask you about a fascinating, massively important political event? Well, it is an election, isn't it? Yeah. We got quite a few questions about Conclave. Hugo Craggs seems to think he speaks for all humanity. We have all watched Conclave. We don't know that we've all watched Conclave, but fair enough, Hugo. A lot of people have watched Conclave, the film. So question to you is, who are the front runners for the papacy? From which wing of the church are they, and how will the various different factions play out in this Trumpian world? Well, of course, as we said yesterday, Trump thinks he should be the Pope, but let's park that.
Let me begin by saying it's an amazing election. and people have really seen this in that film, that Robert Harris book and the film that came out of it. I've been talking to Rupert Short, who was the TLS religion editor and now teaches at Oxford and has written a really interesting book called The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. And he's been very patient. He's given me 2 hours on the conclave and what's happening with the Pope. I'll try to digest it with apologies to Rupert, who objects to simplification. I think the first thing he'd say is that every one of these elections is a massive, massive game changer. And the really classic example is Pius XII was in for 20 years. They brought in someone called John XIII, who they thought was an elderly man who'd be a safe pair of hands and not shake stuff up too much. And he came in and brought in the Second Vatican Council, which was this biggest thing in 400 years, massive drive towards the kind of liberal wing, got rid of Latin Mass, blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, was only in for a few years, at which point Paul XI arrived, who suffered from something called Hamletismo, in other words, indecision, and seemed to push.
Is that what they call it?
Hamletismo, yeah.
Is that Italian? Is that a genuine word?
Yeah.
Is it a Vatican word or is it an Italian word?
I think it's more Vatican. I think it's something that really he embodied this. Then we had John Paul II, who was supposed to bring strength of character and who was very, very reliant on Cardinal Ratzinger for his theology and was on the more conservative side. And Ratzinger, of course, became Pope Benedict. And then Pope Francis came in. And again, this is another point, which is the complete unpredictability of these people. And actually, I'm going to be very interested in this in a lot of these elections, because I think one of the stories of elections is you have, as you keep saying, no idea what somebody's going to be like as a leader till they're actually there.
Mm.
You can't really tell whether they're sounding cautious before an election and then they come in and they're massively radical, or they're sounding radical before the election, they come and don't really do very much.
Also, are these guys allowed to campaign? Can they sort of go round the conclave saying, look, I don't know if you've thought this about me, but actually I'm very this and I'm very that. Can they do that?
Robert Harris illustrates it very well, what's happening. So they're all locked up together. All the cardinals are locked up together. And it's very important for this election.
No phones?
No phones,
no internet,
contact with the outside world. There's a very naughty thing happening in Conclave, which is the man organising the election, played by Ralph Fiennes, has a bit of contact with the outside world.
Yeah.
But basically you're not supposed to have any contact with the outside world at all.
And the Ralph Fiennes character in the film, is he the Irish guy who's the current sort of stand-in for the Pope, or is he the state secretary who's also one of the candidates? Can you be the organiser and a candidate?
Yes, absolutely, which indeed Ralph Fiennes was in that movie, an organiser and a candidate. So Francis, for example, came in and people thought he was going to be quite, conservative. He'd been quite an authoritarian provincial and came in and became quite a liberal pope. And one of the big controversies, the heart of this whole thing about what direction the church goes in, is that a lot of conservatives, particularly American conservative Catholics, the kind of J.D. Vance wing of the party, did not like the fact that he thought that you could bless divorced couples. They also didn't like his line when asked about sexuality. He said, "Who am I to judge?" Mm. The basic answer there is, well,
you're the Pope.
You're the Pope.
You're the top man.
You're supposed to be judging. So in terms
just
of...
you mentioned Vance there. Do you think that Vance's visit to meet the Pope and be publicly the last person to see him, which started all that stuff about, whatever you do, don't meet J.D. Vance, you could die the next day, added to Trump's AI photo? Do you think that will weaken any American influence? Because the politicians do try to influence this event.
Yeah, they do. They do. And Americans are the big fundraisers.
Yeah.
Big philanthropic fundraisers. So one of the problems has been that some of the figures associated with sex abuse have been big American fundraisers. And that's been a big problem in the past. Sex abuse has kicked in again also because two of the leading candidates, so Paroline, who's the kind of continuity candidate.
He's the state secretary, or
exactly.
He's like the foreign minister, yeah.
And he's the guy who did this very controversial deal with China, where China seems to be given a sort of veto over the appointment of bishops, which led to Cardinal Zen, who's the very famous Hong Kong bishop who bore witness against the Chinese government.
And there's some guy from the Philippines who would be the first Asian pope for a long, long time. He's another one who didn't criticize them enough.
He was a big leader, but there's been a big article in the Times, very, very credible female journalists now coming out and pointing to their role in all of this stuff. So they could be taken out at the last minute by this.
When you say taken out, we're not talking mafia taken out.
No. But you saw in the conclave that
you're suddenly up and then you're gone.
Then you're gone because you go up in the votes. It's very, very the voting system is almost identical to conservative leadership election, the way in which it works.
Liz Truss for Pope.
And also this sort of weird thing that you see illustrated in conclave, which was true for someone like me running leadership, which is you can get relatively few number of votes in an early stage, but as people drop out, you can suddenly jump lots of number of votes, and then you can drop again as people flip back and forward.
I saw the film a long time ago. I can't remember. Does it go down in the end to a vote of two between two candidates?
Two candidates.
It's not a single transferable vote thing. You actually go through, you just drop out and then you have the vote again.
Exactly. People drop out.
Quite exciting, isn't it?
So very, very exciting. And
should be on telly, really.
The question, I guess, for the church is, are they going to look, and the rumor is what they're going to be looking for, is a slightly more conservative, steady hand than Pope Francis. Because Pope Francis, a bit like Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks in Britain, is somebody who was almost more popular with people outside the hierarchy. The sort of general population he was within the hierarchy. They thought he was maybe a bit loose. We were talking about Tony Blair. He maybe, as an experienced man, he shouldn't have been creating headlines quite as much as he did off there.
Yeah.
So we'll see. And there's some very interesting sort of marginal characters. There's a very interesting Ghanaian candidate. I've been reading a book recently by Robert Sarah, who's from Guinea, who is a formidable intellectual, very profound mystic, but also can be extraordinarily kind of conservative and intolerant about the modern world. And I think that would be sad. And he's almost 80.
I'm going for Matteo Zuppi.
Oh, right. An Italian Pope again.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. The guy I want is a guy called Aveline. And I don't know anything about him other than the fact that he's from Marseille. And I like
Marseille. Love Marseille.
I like the football team and I like the place, yeah. There is an American-born guy in the running, this guy, Robert Francis Prevost. The other thing I didn't realise is that one of the things that's being held against my man from Marseille is that he's not entirely fluent in Italian. And this is a really stupid question, but is Italian the language of the Vatican?
Traditionally it was Latin.
Yeah,
but actually increasingly they don't speak Latin to each other; they speak Italian to each other.
So they do speak Italian. Yeah, so that might be
all the cardinals sort of speak in Italian all the time. Yeah.
The reason I like Zuppi, and this is really trivializing a very important thing, his nickname is Don Matteo, who is a crime-solving priest on Italian television.
Very good.
So they
Very good.
So I'm going for Zuppie, and I think to have a name beginning with Z is quite dramatic.
Thank goodness you're not voting. You're doing it all on the basis of their names.
No, I do think it's important. And what's extraordinary is when the white smoke comes out, which is how they announce, we've got a pope, a person that now, today, you and I have probably not heard of, is going to become overnight one of the best known, most recognized, most talked about, most written about people on the planet. It's a really interesting thing where suddenly they become big figures, and they could become big figures for good, which I think most people would argue Pope Francis did, or for bad.
Well, I'm going to come now to a question for you from Ronnie, but just a sort of small note. The church in many ways pioneered democracy. I'm very struck by the fact
that's not a small note, that's a really big note.
Yeah.
We could do a whole episode on that.
Well, it just struck when I stayed in monasteries, it's almost always been the case that the abbot is elected by the other monks.
Yeah.
And that's been true from the very, very earliest days. And it's really interesting because they'll spend 20 years looking at this person, and then they'll, even Trappist monasteries don't even speak, they look at this person and choose them. Right. Just to put you on the spot here, Deborah from Germany. I think I can guess your answer to this, but should Tony Blair be expelled from the Labour Party for his egregious backstabbing manoeuvre on the eve of the local elections? I'm quoting Deborah here. Trashing the government's net zero policy, which led to rejoicing in the ranks of Reform and the Conservatives, and will definitely have caused some voters to switch to either Reform Conservatives or the Green Party. Or Sam from Cambridge. Does Alastair think Tony Blair's climate change outburst was wise, given the clear conflict of interest with the Saudi interests? Or perhaps more politely, so we don't actually get you back up from the beginning and put you into fuel defensive mode. Douglas Thackway, do you agree with Tony Blair's intervention regarding net zero policy in the UK? Do you agree?
Well, I'm guessing that Deborah and Sam and Douglas and the many, many, many others who asked questions about Tony Blair and net zero have not necessarily read the Tony Blair Institute report that led to the screaming front page headlines. However, I did remind him in an exchange of messages and a phone call that he is a very experienced politician. He knows that in the week of the local election, at a time when the Reform in particular are banging on about net zero, the timing was far from helpful.
Presumably in his defense, what he said to you on the phone or the text is, that really wasn't what I meant. And if people had read the full report, they would have realized they had a much more nuanced position, to which your response would have been?
That's all very well, but we are 3 days away from the local elections and nobody's going to read it in the way that you'd like them to. If you do read the report, which I did afterwards, actually there's lots where he supports what the government is doing. He's actually making a bigger point about some of the strategic issues involved in the move to net zero. But I think it's fair to say Ed Miliband was not happy.
Well, let me try to play devil's advocate and see if I can make the case for Tony Blair. So, channeling Blair, I think what he'd probably say is we're in real danger of ending up with expensive energy. We saw that British Steel, 50% more for the energy to run British Steel than European competitors, probably 4 times more than US competitors. We are chasing dropping carbon production in the UK and killing our industries potentially in the process. And we're not making much impact on the big global picture in the end because we're a pretty small economy.
That's why he was actually addressing the world rather than the UK, but yeah.
Yeah, and we're not properly taxing carbon consumption. In other words, we push all the factories into China and we continue to buy just as many T-shirts and toys as we did in the past. So we're not actually affecting our full carbon footprint. So I think there are 2 sorts of pretty serious arguments you can make, politics aside, which actually have been made in some of our leading interviews. The first argument is the argument that Dieter Helm made when we interviewed him on Leading, which is that the whole thing is nonsense and the climate stuff is nonsense and the Paris targets are nonsense unless we actually put a proper global carbon tax in place, which properly puts the cost of embedded carbon into place. Right? And the second argument, which is the argument that was made to some extent when we interviewed Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman on the show, that the real answer to this is technology, and that rather than cutting production, what we should be doing is putting a lot of money into carbon capture, AI, nuclear fusion, and other ways of generating.
That is exactly what Tony was saying.
And presumably because he hangs out with people like Reid Hoffman and Bill Gates.
Yeah, and I think because I think he has thought it through and his institute's thinking it through. And I don't disagree with that, but I don't resile from the point that he is ultimately one of the most high-profile, experienced politicians on the planet, Anyway, we had some very friendly, lively exchanges about whether it would have. As I said yesterday, I don't want to sound like Roy Keane, but Tony, that wouldn't have happened in my day.
Very good. Okay, Ronnie, given Germany's history, it seems appropriate that the German spy agency has labelled the AfD an extremist group. Why have so many Americans leapt to the AfD's defence? So tell us about this as our German expert.
Well, the German, it's not quite the equivalent of MI5, but it's a sort of the intelligence agency that part of its role is to ensure that the German constitution is upheld. And there's been this debate. There was a debate actually about whether they should have done this before the election, and they felt they had to stay out of politics. So they didn't do it before that, but it was widely expected that they would identify the AfD as a far-right extremist party. Interestingly, one of their MPs has stood down on the back of it. I think if this was Trumpian, and it's the same as Le Pen. Le Pen, the judgment that she cannot stand, seems to have been broadly accepted by the public. And likewise, so this is one of their representatives who said, no, if we're identified as right-wing extremists, I can't be part of this. But I think what the danger with it, at a time when you've got the new government coming in, Merz, as we're speaking, has just lost a vote to become Chancellor in the Parliament. He was expecting to win on the first vote. So there is the danger that you have the Romanian effect, this sense that if you're taking people away from what the public have done, the public have voted for these people to have some say in their lives, and you're then saying, no, they can't be part of this debate. We're going to see similar here, by the way. We talked in our local elections yesterday. You've got a very interesting case in Doncaster, where the mayor has been re-elected, who's Labour, but the council has gone overwhelmingly Reform, and it's how does that relationship now work out? So I think this debate, the government, Merz has been quite cautious about it. He said, look, the Interior Ministry has to study the report, etc., etc. But they're going to have to make big judgments, because how can you identify a party as being right-wing extremist and essentially anti-constitutional, and yet at the same time they've got this huge block sitting there in the Parliament. So it's quite a big problem.
Yeah, a big problem, and of course set up after the Second World War deliberately to prevent the rise of another Nazi party. And so there's a very formal technocratic procedure where these agencies, spies, the Constitutional Court, weighs all the evidence. And so they determined in the past that it was okay to refer to some AfD members as fascists. Now they've been labelled as extremists, but this really matters because it's all about trying to protect the German constitution.
Yeah, and the other part of the question about the people weighing in, I mean, two of the first people to weigh in were J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. If I were Mark Carney, ahead of the G7, I think I would, which is coming shortly, I think I would sort of write to all the leaders and say, I'm happy for this meeting to go ahead, but I really think it's about time that we stopped interfering in each other's domestic politics. Shut up about the 51st state. Shut up about the AfD. Tell your friend Musk to shut up about riots in the UK. I mean, what the hell has it got to do with J.D. Vance?
The Marco Rubio thing is also weird.
And also he doesn't believe it for a second.
So I was talking to a very senior American State Department diplomat who was responsible for all their policy in Africa. And she was explaining to me that in African elections, even as recently as 4 months ago, inconceivable that they would ever have backed one party over another, made any public statements as the American government. In fact, they actually went out of their way always to reach out with equal time to all the leading candidates. This thing of, the CIA, of course, in the 70s and 80s,
they interfered the whole time,
but covertly,
but not the politicians.
I mean, it's really, really weird.
But also Trump last week had, is it the Polish presidential election that's coming up? And he had the opposition candidate in the White House last week saying what a great guy he was. So this is absolute blatant interference. And it's usually based on ignorance. It's usually based on them not understanding. So the fact is, would J.D. Vance understand what the German constitution says, why this matters, why it's rooted in law and in history?
I think what's so interesting about this particular Trump government is, I think I'm right in saying, it's the American government which is the least European in terms of its experience of any American government that I can ever think of. Many of them in the past would have spent some time studying at European universities. They would have served in the military in Germany. They would have fought alongside Europeans. it's very, very interesting how little contact emotionally they have to Europe.
The other thing about Vance, I thought of this in relation to the Pope. When Trump did the AI picture of him as the Pope, here's this guy who's like, allegedly a kind of really big Catholic. Why is he saying nothing? The MAGA crowd, do you remember when the Paris Olympic opening ceremony, there was that sketch about the Last Supper?
Yeah.
The MAGA crowd went nuts.
Yeah.
They went absolutely crazy about it. This is sacrilegious, da-da-da. There's his boss, Trump, posing as the Pope, and Vance says, oh, that's all fine.
Yeah.
Let me rant on about the AfD in Germany instead. Okay, Rory, quick break. Then I want to ask you about King Charles heading to Canada.
Good. Look forward to it.
The Rest is Politics is sponsored by Moneybox.
And Alastair, I think this could be an opportunity to talk about something that really does affect all listeners' lives, which is the question of money and savings.
Well, Rory, we've been working with Moneybox for quite a while now, and we do have a lot of our listeners who are now new Moneybox customers.
Because with a Moneybox Cash ISA, you can be earning a better interest rate on your normal savings, and they make it very easy to open an account in-app or online.
Now, we love a British success story, and I hadn't quite appreciated just how much Moneybox has grown since they launched 10 years ago, and they've got the Which seal of approval as a recommended savings provider.
With a Moneybox Cash ISA, you can earn a great interest rate, save up to £20,000 each year without paying any tax on the interest. Why not compare it with your current savings rate and see if it's worth switching?
So download the Moneybox app today or sign up online at moneyboxapp.com. FSCS protected up to £85,000, ISA and tax rules apply. Welcome back to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
So Patrick Keelty, I'm assuming, because I do know he listens, that may be Patrick Keelty, the presenter of the Late Late Show in Dublin. What do you make of the timing of King Charles' visit to Canada, where he will open Parliament and deliver the speech from the throne? A monarch has not delivered a throne speech in Canada since 1977 or opened the Canadian Parliament since 1957. Now, I think this is your friend, the King, sending a very strong message to DJ Trump.
Well, yeah, to remind everybody, of course, King Charles is the head of state of Canada and Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom and other places too. And he's in a very interesting position because the King is somebody that Trump seems to venerate. He seems to have, and Trump claims it's because of his mother, this very strong interest in the monarchy. And I think the Mooch has reflected on this a bit, that because Trump sort of sees himself as a bit of a monarch. He's really interested in these kind of ancient institutions. And so the King is in a very interesting position because he seems to have this kind of credibility and leverage. It was used by Keir Starmer because, of course, King Charles is a constitutional monarch, so he has to respond to the elected government. Keir Starmer used a letter from King Charles and to invite Trump on a state visit, which caused a lot of controversy. And Canadians felt very angry about this because this was happening at the same time as Trump was saying that Canada should be the 51st state. What the King essentially symbolizes is a statement of, excuse me, Donald Trump, Canada isn't a 51st state. I'm the head of state of Canada. And insofar as you claim to have this great reverence for me and my institution, you're trying to take part of the country that I'm the head of state of. They also have a strong relationship, Mark Carney and the King, because they work very, very closely on climate finance and sustainable market initiative. Back when Mark Carney was working at the Bank of England, they had a huge interest in. We talked about Tony Blair and net zero. What the King and Mark Carney were really focused on is how you get the corporate sector and the trillions of finance behind shift to renewable biodiversity. And of course, Mark Carney visited the King when he was over. So I think it's something which is very deliberate and is an interesting question of the ways in which British soft power could continue to operate in this trouble.
And also because, I mean, look, Mark Carney's had huge attention around the world because of the nature of his rise, becoming Prime Minister, winning the election. But it also means that here we are today, we're speaking on the day that the new German government is taking office. Now, it might be on the news a bit, but it won't be kind of wall to wall across the news channels. But the fact of King Charles going to open the Canadian Parliament means that Mark Carney's first King's speech is going to get way more global attention than it otherwise would. And you can bet your bottom dollar it's going to be shown live on all the American channels, which, of course, Trump will be hopping between. I think it's a great move. And as you say, when the King does something on behalf of the UK government, whether it was taking part in the VE Day things or whatever, or, as you say, opening the Parliament, he will not have done this without probably having had it suggested by Mark Carney, and would probably wanted to have checked with the UK government as well. I don't know how this specifically works, but so that means he has been confronted with the choice and he's decided, yep, I'm going to do that. Good for him, I say.
Question for you on the UK and Europe. Guy Schaffer from Scotland. What effect would Britain returning to the European single market have on the British farming sector? Would it benefit or harm agricultural interests in the UK?
Positive and benefit. And one of the things I said yesterday that I was worried that the reaction to the local elections will be to kind of be a bit more reformy in some areas. I am really more and more of the view that on the Brexit issues, the government has to be less timid, more ambitious. Got this big meeting on May the 19th, Keir Starmer hosting European Union heads of government. I really think something really big has got to come out of that in terms of signaling direction. It won't be this, but I think there are so many different areas where the government could be coming to an arrangement with the Europeans that would get us in a better place. But it's a big political choice, and I do think we've just been too timid about this because we keep saying we don't want to revisit the arguments of 2016. It's almost a decade ago now, but I think it's become settled, even amongst Brexiteers. I meet loads of them that, well, regardless of what I thought at the time, it's not really gone as planned. So that gives the government an opportunity.
Small footnote on farmers. The small farmers in particular were a real beneficiary of the Common Agricultural Policy because France and many of the Mediterranean members of the European Union really believe in farmers, really believe in their role in culture, their role in communities, their role in landscape. And so they had these single farm payments designed basically to keep small farms alive. And in Scotland and Wales, essentially these structures remained in place. But England, under both the Conservatives and Labour, went really weirdly ideological and basically against small farmers, put all the emphasis either on biodiversity and rewilding from the environmental side or on production and scale, big farms on the other side. And in my former constituency, Cumbria, you can see so quickly that we're going to be losing, in some cases, hundreds of years worth of landscape and things we've preserved, in some cases almost since the Norman Conquest, falling very, very quickly away. And within 10, 15 years, people will go into the landscapes of places like the Lake District, and there won't be farms there anymore. And we will miss them terribly. And it's nowhere in our debate.
Now, we've got a question here, rather shameless self-plugging by one of our colleagues in the podcast world, Mr. Al Murray.
Oh, yes.
Their podcast on the Second World War, We Have Ways. Hi, chaps. We interviewed Sir Keir Starmer on the podcast yesterday. Episode is out today if anyone wants to listen. After our historical chat, I think by that he means they talked about history as opposed to it was a historic conversation in itself. Starmer mentioned the importance of rearmament for UK economic growth, not just strengthening NATO. Where should the government focus investment in terms of defence? Land forces, naval strength, emerging warfare like drone technologies. We actually talked to Alex Younger about that. He was talking about the, in the Ukrainian context, the defence manufacturing industry is changing so fast. So there you go. Help Al plug his podcast. He's obviously looking on the lookout for new listeners.
Well, firstly, both Al Murray's podcast and our podcast are coming out on Victory in Europe 80th anniversary. And many of you who live in London, for example, will have seen Lancaster bombers flying over on the Bank Holiday Monday. And I'm really struck by this. I've been doing a little bit for the amazing Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which helps preserve the graves, including my father's brother, my uncle's grave in Sicily, and the graves that I saw in Iraq and elsewhere. And it's also interesting in the family because my sister's been trying to get going on VE Day celebrations in our town in Crieff and has been sending my mother stuff from the Daily Mail about memories of people who remember VE Day. And my mother's like, well, don't be ridiculous. Why didn't you talk to me? I was 10 years old when VE Day happened. I'm quite happy to talk to you about that. On this question, we should do a bigger thing on this. Technology is changing very fast, and what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine is right at the heart of this, particularly cheap drones, electronic warfare, raises huge questions about these expensive platforms, $150 million F-35 planes, aircraft carriers, all of them now under threat from drones that cost a few $1,000s.
Mm.
And there's a very, very complicated story about how all these things are coordinated in the information space, how an iPhone links up to what you get from a plane and how this all works. So we should do this properly. But Al Murray is completely right to ask it. And if one was really brave about drones, AI, cyber technology, a huge amount of legacy weapon systems will become obsolete. But you still ultimately need to fire missiles and drop large amounts of munition on people in order to kill them.
And have ships and have an army, have a big army. I mean, I think what would be interesting, maybe we should dig this up for next week and talk about it, is I know the technologies are changing, but if we just look at the sheer numbers and how they have changed in what were then the major powers and what are now the major powers. And I was looking at the stats the other day for the growth of the Chinese military. It is absolutely phenomenal. Whereas, we can now fit the entirety of our army into one of our bigger football stadiums. Anyway, thanks for that, Al. And sticking on security issues, Mr. Dominic Thorrington, I've just finished listening to the excellent interview you did with Sir Alex Younger, that's the former head of MI6, on leading. At the end of the episode, Rory mentioned that he'd met Sir Alex in 4 different positions at SIS. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that Rory's let slip any past work at SIS, after maintaining for years that he's never been a spook. Dominic, I don't think you've been listening closely. So could Rory please discuss just a little how he managed to meet the future C whilst in these different roles?
I
met him.
You met him,
quite a few
exactly.
times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I met him as a minister. I met him as a member of parliament. I met him
in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I met him as somebody running a charity in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But really encourage people to listen to it, and also encourage people to listen. If we haven't plugged enough Atul Gawande, who I thought was incredibly wonderful, who's this extraordinary, impressive doctor who I'd like to see almost given a Nobel Prize, who talked both about what's happening in the world of international development and infectious diseases, but also about advanced medical technology. So that's me avoiding the question. Right, over to you. Question on towns and cities. Will Barrow, is the political divide between the inner city metropolitan areas and the rest of the country now bigger than ever? How big a problem is that for our national politics? Quick explainer, Alastair, as we go into the question. Essentially, parties like the Conservative Party don't have any votes in inner city metropolitan areas anymore. They're Labour heartlands. London's a classic example of this. Do you feel there's a big divide, and is it a big problem for our national politics?
I remember after the Brexit referendum, somebody said that this referendum was won and lost in towns that few of us have ever heard of because they don't have football league football clubs. And I was over the weekend, I was in Gainsborough. I was in a couple of smallish towns in Lincolnshire, which has always been pretty Brexity, but has gone very reform. And I think there is this sense of the divide. And interestingly, in the Australian elections, one of the many, many criticisms that's being made against Dutton, the leader of the Conservatives there, who's just lost, is that he was open in saying that I'm going after, he called them the forgotten people in the suburbs. Now, obviously, Australia's a vast country, whereas, we're pretty crowded. But I think there is a feeling I regularly hear people, in fact, this happened, I went to the Burnley Player of the Year Awards the other day, and there's quite a few of the fans were there, and I was chatting away to some of them. Some of them, they absolutely have this belief that London has everything. And then a sort of dialed down version of that is Manchester has everything, Leeds has everything. And I think there is, if you look at the people who Labour now look to, used to be sort of traditional working class voters. I mean, the classic Labour voter now is the sort of professional graduate. I saw some data on this the other day that if you have no education beyond 16, you are 4 times more likely to vote Reform than if you are educated beyond A levels. And obviously you've got uneducated people in cities and you've got lots of educated people in towns. But I think that sense of cities feeling vibrant, dynamic about the future, and a lot of towns feeling pretty run down is a problem. And I think the New Towns Fund, although it's got, I think, a lot going for it, just to give you a very, very small example, I had a phone call last week for Keighley Cougars, a rugby league club in Keighley, where I come from, and they'd been promised funding under the New Towns Fund, and suddenly they see the council trying to undo it. And I think that's just because you combine resources, really tight control on resources, and people feeling that in the smaller towns, maybe they don't have to worry so much because the backlash won't be that great. That is another message of these local elections.
You know, we were talking in the last podcast about what the difference might be between Britain, Australia and Canada, despite all the similarities. And it strikes me that the biggest difference is that those are federal systems where you have these very, very strong local regional governments. You know, we interviewed Peter Malinauskas, for example, on Leading, who's doing very different things in South Australia to elsewhere.
Yeah.
And if you have a more devolved federal system, inevitably, you're going to get more investment and infrastructure prioritizing those places instead of what we have in Britain, which is the Treasury gets its numbers out, does its calculations, and every pound invested in London always looks better on their spreadsheets because they get a better return from it. They're thinking short term, not long term. So I think if we're really going to fix this over the longer term and get moderate centre ground politics back, we need to have something more like a federal system where we're properly devolving down.
Well, if you know, I was in Manchester, as I say, over the weekend, and you know, Manchester just feels kind of buzzy and like it's always been a buzzy place, and it's always been one of our bigger, better cities, but it feels very, very different. Now, I'm not saying that's all down to Andy Burnham, but I do think that sense of Manchester having its own identity through the football clubs, through an elected mayor that people know inside Manchester and outside Manchester. I honestly do believe this, and it's got to be more devolution, but with the power and with the financing, and not having screaming habdabs every time that, for example, Andy Burnham recently said, we've got to start calling out the disaster of Brexit. Sadiq has said the same. Eleanor Morgan in Wales saying that, you know, she's going to campaign against some of the welfare changes. Now, I know that Peter Kyle, if he's listening, will say, oh, he's asked to go on his, you know, you say it would have happened if your day, it exactly would have happened in your day that you'd have got a grip of all this. But if we believe in devolution, we've got to genuinely believe it. Now, how about this as a final question, Rory, from Nick Longson? You can always judge a person's character by their musical tastes. What are you into? Can you expose any shockers or speculate on the taste of any world leaders? Well, of course, we know about Albanese because he told us about.
He pointed out he missed K-pop entirely.
He did, but he's a big rock. He's a rock music guy. Yeah. He's really into rock music. Tony Blair was into rock music.
Tony Blair had a band, didn't he, at university?
He was in the Ugly Rumours, yeah.
The Ugly Rumours, yeah.
So come on, I've never really got to the bottom of your lack of musical taste.
Well, okay, so here's the shocker. I went to a Resta's history show, live show at the Albert Hall, where they were playing Tchaikovsky.
Pedaltry, we call it. But
Pedaltry. And I suddenly realised that some of Tchaikovsky is actually my vision of hell. I have never felt so bored, appalled, and sort of revolted in my life.
That's the podcast. What about the music?
No, it's not the podcast. Tchaikovsky, the composer. Sometimes I sit there listening to some of his ballet music and I actually feel my life going away from me. I remember at the age of 15, a more painful experience as a nutcracker. More painful experience listening to that. And also one of his violin concertos. I feel more unhappy listening to Tchaikovsky's music than almost anything on earth. So there's my little revelation. Go on, tell us
what about something you like, though? That's something you don't like.
I completely love church music. I love Mozart. I love Bach deeply, deeply. I can stretch as far as Beethoven. I can get about as far as Schubert.
Okay.
By the time
and now let's come into the modern age.
Yeah. By the time
what's your favourite?
I got to Tchaikovsky, I've given up. Rolling Stones. I like Rolling Stones.
What's your favourite Rolling Stones song? You're not allowed to say Satisfaction.
No. What I like. What's that one about? What's the one about? Okay. What's the one about? It's the devil speaking.
This is all staying in. This is like Trump. This is like Trump when he was asked about which is his favourite bit of the Bible.
Anyway, listen. The reality is that I don't really listen to anything except classical music before about 1840.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you want to know what I listened to all the way from through the Manchester, through the Peak District?
ABBA.
Which is beautiful. Well, ABBA was part of it because I was channel hopping between Heart Greatest Hits, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. You can do it by the decade.
So Heart is your thing? Heart FM?
No, not Heart. Sometimes it's the other channels, but...
What's the other ones you like then, of those radio channels you see on when you go in an Uber?
Magic. I sometimes do Radio 1 to try and sort of stay in a bit with what's happening.
But Radio
now.
1's a bit trendy for you, is it? It's
A little
basically
bit,
things like Magic and Heart. Yeah.
The other one I listen is Magic Soul, Soul, and you get. I'm really into Motown.
And is it Six music? Do you do that?
Yeah, a little bit, but
My Devil song, the producers just pointed out, is called Sympathy.
Sympathy for the Devil.
Sympathy for the Devil.
Yeah. I just think it's sad because it's. I find music. I like some classical music. I'm like you. Fiona loves going to ballet and opera and all that stuff, and sometimes I like it, but sometimes I don't. But I could listen to a lot of modern pop music all day long.
I could listen to Handel all day long.
Yeah,
I like
church music.
I love tenor voices.
Yeah.
I love Gregorian plainsong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
all that stuff.
Philip Gould, he when he was dying, listened to Gregorian chanting quite a lot.
That's good. Hey, I had a final story on dying. One of my most grand aristocratic friends, her grandfather, when he was dying, he rigged up his bed with his pillow behind him, and he attached a set of reins, like the sort you use to ride a horse, to the four-poster bed at the other end. And his butler read him from his hunting diaries while he held on to his reins till he died.
What's that got to do with music?
It's just a story about Philip Gould and dying.
Oh, I see. There's a dying story. It's music. Okay. Well, listen, I'm sticking with music because I'm leaving from here to go to Pentonville prison to play my bagpipes to the prisoners. If they haven't suffered enough, they're going to have me explaining to them how bagpipes work.
Here's a final story from the same man.
You should love that. We're taking music into our prisons.
It's really cool that you're taking music in prison. I'm really pleased, and also pay tribute to the amazing work that's done with opera in prisons.
Yeah.
Thank goodness there's not much ballet in prisons going on, otherwise I wouldn't go and watch it. Listen, final anecdote to really annoy you in terms of this guy and his horse. So he during the Second World War, he was
Who was this guy?
Fox hunting. I don't want to dish him in it, but he's fox hunting, and he's got his full hunting pinks on, and he's charging with his horse and his hounds and things.
It's a real hunt as opposed to
real hunt, chasing their fox, and the fox gets into a football pitch where some young men are playing football. I don't know, sort of 1943. And the fox manages to get out the other end. And so the hunt has lost the fox. And the Lord leans down from his hunter and looks at these young men and he says, "What the bloody hell do you think you're doing? Don't you realize there's a war on?"
You got to name names, Rory. You can't tell stories about that, about your fellow toffs. Well, there you go. We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we?
We have. Thank you very much.
I'm still determined to educate you in modern music.
Good luck.
I'm going to take you to Aber Voyage.
Good luck. Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.